There is a feeling almost everyone has known, yet few have ever truly understood. It has no clear shape, leaves no visible wound, and often arrives quietly without warning. Your chest tightens, your breath becomes shallow, your mind begins racing ahead of reality, rehearsing disasters that have not happened. Today, we call this anxiety. We often assume it is a modern illness, born from speed, noise, social pressure, and endless information. We speak of it as though it belongs uniquely to our age. But what if the human mind has always carried this weight? And what if, long before psychology gave it a name, others had already learned to see it clearly? The ancient Stoics did not speak of anxiety as a medical condition. They had no clinical language, no diagnoses, no therapeutic frameworks. Yet they watched the human mind with extraordinary patience and honesty. They noticed that people rarely suffer because of what is happening now. They suffer because of what they believe might happen later. In their eyes, anxiety was not rooted in the present moment, but in the future imagined too vividly, too emotionally, and too prematurely. It was the mind stepping out of reality and living inside a story of fear. Picture a man in ancient Rome, awake before dawn, standing in silence as the city slowly stirs. He does not know whether he will retain his position, his reputation, or even his safety. Life in his time is uncertain, often brutal. And yet, what disturbs his sleep is not the events themselves, but the way his mind grips them, repeats them, and turns possibility into certainty. For the Stoics, anxiety was never an external enemy. It was an internal confusion, a subtle mistake where imagination was treated as truth. What is striking is that the Stoics did not aim to eliminate anxiety in the way we often try to today. They did not promise comfort, nor did they chase constant calm. Instead, they asked a slow, deliberate question, one that required courage rather than optimism. Is this within my control? This question was not meant to soothe. It was meant to clarify. And clarity, they believed, was more powerful than reassurance. When a person honestly recognizes that most of what they fear lies beyond their control, the mind begins to release its grip. Not because the world has become safer, but because the mind has become more truthful. The Stoics understood something deeply human. The mind exaggerates. It stretches small concerns into vast threats. It paints the future in dark, absolute tones. Left unchecked, a single thought can grow into a storm. Their practice, therefore, was not to suppress fear, but to examine it. To look at a fearful thought and ask whether it was a fact or merely an impression, whether it deserved belief or simply observation. Rather than attempting to control outcomes, they trained themselves to stand firmly in the present. They treated anxiety as a signal, not a sentence. A signal pointing to a belief that required inspection. If the belief was false, it could be released. If it was true, it could be faced with dignity rather than panic. This approach did not promise a life without uncertainty. It offered a life without unnecessary suffering. Perhaps this is why Stoic wisdom still speaks to us today. Not because it removes anxiety entirely, but because it teaches us how to stop feeding it. Long before psychology existed, the Stoics understood that peace does not come from a stable world, but from a mind no longer at war with what it cannot command. And in that quiet acceptance, anxiety begins to lose its authority. To understand what the Stoics truly knew about anxiety, we must slow down and look at how they understood the human mind itself, not as something broken, but as something easily misled. They believed the mind does not suffer directly from events. It suffers from judgments. Between what happens and how we feel about it, there is a silent space, and inside that space, a decision is made. Most people never notice this moment. Anxiety grows precisely there, unnoticed, unchallenged, and therefore powerful. The Stoics called these first mental reactions impressions. An impression arrives instantly. It feels convincing. It speaks with urgency. A sound in the night becomes danger. A delayed message becomes rejection. A distant future becomes a looming threat. Anxiety begins when the mind accepts the impression as truth without examination. The Stoics did not deny that impressions arise. They knew this was natural. What concerned them was how quickly we surrender to them. In their view, anxiety is not the impression itself, but our agreement with it. This is where Stoic thought becomes radically different from modern habits. Today, we often ask, "Why do I feel this way?" The Stoics asked, "What belief have I just accepted?" They understood that feelings follow judgments as shadows follow objects. Change the object, and the shadow changes with it. Anxiety, therefore, was not something to fight emotionally, but something to investigate intellectually. Calm was not achieved by force, but by clarity. They taught that most anxious thoughts share a common pattern. They speak about things outside our control, other people's opinions, future outcomes, health, loss, failure, death. The mind treats these as if they were personal responsibilities, as if constant worry could somehow influence their direction. The Stoics saw this as a quiet form of arrogance, not pride in achievement, but pride in assumed control. Anxiety to them was the mind pretending it could govern what was never entrusted to it. When a Stoic felt anxiety rising, the response was not to distract the mind or drown it in reassurance. Instead, they paused and separated what belonged to them from what did not. Their own judgments, their choices, their actions in the present moment. These were within their power. Everything else was not. This distinction was not philosophical decoration. It was a daily discipline. Each time the mind crossed that boundary, suffering followed. Each time it returned, peace slowly reappeared. They also understood that anxiety feeds on time. It rarely speaks about now. It whispers about later. The Stoics trained themselves to return attention to the present, not as a technique, but as a moral practice. To live in the present was not to ignore the future, but to refuse to live in an imagined one. Anxiety collapses when deprived of its preferred territory. In the present moment, action is possible. In the future, only speculation exists. Another insight the Stoics held was that anxiety often disguises itself as concern. We tell ourselves we worry because we care, because we are responsible, because we are thoughtful. The Stoics challenged this self-image. They argued that genuine care leads to action, not rumination. If something can be addressed, act. If it cannot, accept. Endless mental rehearsal serves neither wisdom nor virtue. Anxiety, they believed, was often concern that had lost its direction. Importantly, the Stoics did not condemn anxiety as weakness. They recognized it as a human signal, a sign that the mind had drifted away from reason. Signals are not enemies. They are messages. Anxiety was telling the Stoic that a judgment required correction. This removed shame from the experience. One could notice anxiety without identifying with it. It was not, "I am anxious," but an anxious impression has appeared. That small shift created space, and space created choice. What the Stoics knew, long before psychology named it, was that anxiety thrives in unexamined beliefs. It fades when those beliefs are exposed to reason. Not optimism, not denial, but sober assessment. The world remains uncertain. Loss remains possible. Death remains inevitable. Yet the Stoic mind learns to walk through this uncertainty without trembling, not because it feels nothing, but because it no longer confuses fear with truth. In this way, Stoicism did not promise freedom from anxiety. It offered freedom from being ruled by it. And that difference changes everything. The Stoics also understood something that feels uncomfortable to admit. Anxiety is often sustained not by danger, but by resistance. The more the mind insists that uncertainty should not exist, the more violently it reacts when uncertainty appears. In this sense, anxiety is not only fear of what may happen, it is refusal to accept that life is, by nature, unstable. The Stoics did not see this instability as a flaw in existence, but as one of its defining conditions. They taught that much of human suffering comes from demanding guarantees from a world that cannot give them. When the mind says, "This must not go wrong," or "I cannot endure loss," anxiety tightens its grip. These statements are not predictions, they are demands. And when reality fails to obey, fear rushes in to fill the gap. The Stoics believed peace begins when demands are replaced with understanding. Life does not owe us certainty. It offers us participation. One of their most powerful tools against anxiety was a practice many modern minds misunderstand: negative visualization. At first glance, it sounds like inviting fear. In truth, it was designed to disarm it. The Stoics would calmly imagine loss, illness, exile, death, not to suffer in advance, but to reduce the shock when such thoughts inevitably arose. Anxiety thrives on surprise. When the mind treats misfortune as unthinkable, even the idea of it becomes terrifying. By making space for possibility, fear loses its intensity. This practice also revealed a deeper insight. Much of what we fear is survivable. The Stoics did not romanticize hardship, but they trusted human resilience. By imagining adversity without panic, they trained the mind to see itself as capable rather than fragile. Anxiety often whispers, "You will not endure this." Stoic reflection quietly responds, "I have endured before, and I will meet what comes when it arrives." They also believed that anxiety is closely tied to attachment, not love or care, but clinging. When identity becomes fused with possessions, status, health, or outcomes, fear becomes inevitable. Anything that can be taken away becomes a source of tension. The Stoics encouraged loving without dependence, engaging without possession. This did not mean withdrawal from life, but participation without fear of loss dominating the mind. Anxiety weakens when attachment loosens. Another dimension of Stoic thought challenges modern assumptions. They did not aim to feel safe, but to be strong. Safety depends on circumstances. Strength depends on character. A person who seeks constant safety will always feel anxious because the world cannot guarantee it. A person who cultivates inner strength may still face danger but will not be mentally undone by it. The Stoics saw courage, wisdom, and self-command as the true antidotes to fear. They also warned against rehearsing anxiety as a habit. Repeated fearful thinking trains the mind to expect catastrophe. What begins as caution becomes reflex. The Stoics urged discipline of attention, not forcing positivity, but refusing to indulge unnecessary fear. The mind, they believed, becomes what it repeatedly practices. Anxiety, when practiced daily, becomes familiar, even comforting in its predictability. Stoic training interrupted this cycle by demanding conscious engagement with thoughts. Importantly, the Stoics recognized that anxiety often disguises itself as preparation. We tell ourselves we are thinking ahead, being responsible, staying alert. Yet endless mental rehearsal rarely improves outcomes. It only exhausts the mind. True preparation involves action, planning where possible, accepting where not. Anxiety offers motion without progress. Stoic wisdom redirected energy back into what could actually be done. At its core, Stoic philosophy did not try to erase fear. Fear had a place. It warned of danger. It protected life. What they opposed was fear ruling reason. Anxiety was fear unmoored from reality, stretched into the future, and fed by imagination. By bringing fear back under the guidance of reason, the Stoics believed the mind could regain balance. What they knew centuries before modern therapy was that anxiety does not disappear when life becomes predictable. It fades when the mind stops demanding predictability. Acceptance, not control, becomes the quiet source of steadiness. And from that steadiness, a deeper confidence begins to grow. The Stoics also understood that anxiety is deeply connected to how we relate to our own thoughts. They observed that most people assume every thought that appears in the mind deserves attention, belief, and emotional response. This assumption quietly turns the mind into a place of constant disturbance. Anxiety flourishes when thoughts are treated as commands rather than suggestions. The Stoics challenged this habit by teaching a radical idea for their time. You are not obligated to obey every thought you experience. They believed the mind produces thoughts the way the body produces sensations. Some are useful, others are not. Feeling cold does not mean danger. Feeling hungry does not mean panic. In the same way, thinking about loss does not mean loss is imminent. Anxiety begins when the mind collapses the distance between thought and reality. The Stoics trained themselves to restore that distance. A thought could be noticed, examined, and either accepted or dismissed. This simple separation weakened anxiety's authority. One of their most practical disciplines was learning to pause before reacting. Anxiety is fast, reason is slow. When the mind reacts immediately, fear leads. When reaction is delayed, clarity has time to enter. The Stoics practiced slowing down not to suppress emotion, but to allow judgment to catch up. They understood that the first impulse is rarely the wisest one. By inserting even a brief pause, anxiety lost momentum. They also emphasized the importance of language. How we speak to ourselves shapes how we feel. Anxiety often uses absolute terms: always, never, disaster, unbearable. The Stoics paid close attention to these exaggerations. They believed that distorted language created distorted emotions. By correcting inner speech, fear softened. "This will ruin me" became "this will be difficult." "I cannot handle this" became "I will respond as best I can." The situation remained the same. The suffering did not. Another crucial insight was their understanding of anticipation. Anxiety lives in anticipation more than experience. People fear pain far longer than they endure it. The Stoics observed that the mind spends vast energy imagining futures that never arrive. Even when hardship does occur, it rarely unfolds as expected. By recognizing this pattern, they learned to distrust anxious predictions, not by replacing them with positive fantasies, but by acknowledging uncertainty honestly. "I do not know what will happen" became a grounding truth. The Stoics also recognized that anxiety increases when the mind becomes self-centered in an unhealthy way. When every event is interpreted as a personal threat, tension becomes constant. They encouraged a broader perspective, to see oneself as part of a larger whole: nature, time, humanity. From this wider view, many fears shrink. What felt overwhelming in isolation becomes manageable in context. This was not dismissal of personal pain, but a rebalancing of importance. They also placed great value on daily mental preparation. Anxiety feels strongest when the mind is caught off guard. The Stoics began each day reminding themselves that difficulty was likely, that people might disappoint, that plans might fail. This was not pessimism, it was realism. By expecting obstacles, they were less disturbed when obstacles appeared. The mind that expects smoothness panics at friction. The mind that expects resistance moves through it calmly. Importantly, Stoic preparation did not focus on controlling events, but on controlling response. They rehearsed patience, restraint, courage. Anxiety weakened because it no longer felt necessary. Fear often believes it must be loud to protect us. When the mind demonstrates strength without panic, fear relaxes its grip. The Stoics trusted character more than worry. They also understood that anxiety often comes from living too far ahead of oneself. The mind races forward while the body remains here. This division creates tension. Stoic practice reunited the two. Attention returned to breath, posture, action, not as meditation techniques, but as reminders of reality. Anxiety fades when attention fully inhabits the present task. The future loses power when the present is fully lived. Another subtle insight was their recognition that anxiety is contagious. Fear spreads through conversation, rumor, and shared panic. The Stoics urged restraint in speech. Not every worry needed to be spoken. Not every fear needed reinforcement. By choosing calm language, they protected both themselves and others. Inner discipline extended outward. Ultimately, the Stoics believed anxiety persisted when the mind forgot its own strength. Fear convinces us we are fragile. Stoic philosophy restored trust in human resilience. They reminded themselves that countless generations before them had faced uncertainty, loss, death, and endured. Anxiety loses power when the mind remembers it is not the first to suffer and will not be the last. What the Stoics knew was not how to eliminate anxiety completely, but how to prevent it from ruling the inner world. They understood that peace is not the absence of threat, but the presence of steadiness. By training judgment, attention, language, and perspective, they built a mind that could remain calm even when life was not. And that calm was not passive. It was strong, alert, and quietly unshakable. The Stoics did not believe that understanding anxiety was enough. Insight without practice meant very little to them. What mattered was how a person lived when anxiety appeared, how they stood, chose, and acted while the mind felt unsettled. Stoicism was never a philosophy meant only for reflection. It was a philosophy for endurance. They believed anxiety reveals itself most clearly in moments of choice. When the mind is anxious, decisions shrink. Options feel fewer, risks feel larger, courage feels distant. The Stoics trained themselves to act according to principle rather than mood. If an action was right, it was done, regardless of fear. This did not eliminate anxiety, but it prevented anxiety from becoming the decision maker. Over time, this practice weakened fear's influence. One of their central disciplines was voluntary discomfort. By occasionally choosing mild hardship, cold, hunger, simplicity, they reduced dependence on comfort. Anxiety feeds on fragility. When the mind believes it cannot tolerate discomfort, fear multiplies. The Stoics reminded themselves through experience that they could endure far more than they imagined. This was not self-punishment. It was preparation. A mind familiar with discomfort is less alarmed by it. They also practiced clarity in action. Anxiety thrives in vagueness. When responsibilities are undefined, the mind fills gaps with worry. The Stoics emphasized identifying the next right action, not the entire path. Focus on what must be done now. Release the rest. This narrowed attention reduced mental noise. Anxiety loses strength when the present moment becomes specific and actionable. Another Stoic strategy was aligning action with values rather than outcomes. Anxiety often arises from attachment to results. The Stoics shifted focus to character. They asked, "Am I acting with wisdom, fairness, courage, self-control?" Outcomes remained uncertain, but integrity was within reach. When action aligns with values, anxiety softens. One can accept failure without losing self-respect. They also believed that anxiety decreases when life becomes ordered. Disorder breeds uncertainty. Uncertainty feeds fear. The Stoics valued routine, simple habits, regular reflection. Each day began and ended with mental review. What was done well? What could improve? What judgments caused disturbance? This was not self-criticism, but calibration. A mind that reflects regularly is less surprised by itself. Another important practice was restraint of desire. Anxiety grows when desire outpaces reality. Wanting what cannot be guaranteed creates tension. The Stoics practiced wanting less, not through denial, but through gratitude. They trained themselves to appreciate what was present rather than chase what was absent. Gratitude anchored attention. Anxiety pulls it away. They also address social sources of anxiety. Much fear arises from concern about reputation and approval. The Stoics reminded themselves that public opinion is unstable and uncontrollable. Living for applause guarantees anxiety. Living for principle reduces it. This did not mean isolation, it meant independence. One could engage socially without surrendering inner peace. The Stoics also practiced deliberate silence. Anxiety often seeks expression. Speaking fear repeatedly reinforces it. They believed not every thought deserved voice. Silence created space for perspective. By choosing when to speak and when not to, they weakened anxiety's tendency to spiral. Importantly, Stoic practice emphasized patience. Anxiety demands immediate resolution. Life rarely offers it. The Stoics trained patience not as passive waiting, but as active endurance, to remain steady while time unfolds. This ability softened urgency and reduced fear. They also trusted repetition. Stoic training was not dramatic. It was daily, quiet, persistent. Each time anxiety arose, the same principles were applied. Over months and years, the mind changed. Fear did not vanish, but it lost authority. Familiarity replaced panic. Ultimately, the Stoics believed anxiety recedes when life is lived deliberately, when actions reflect values, when discomfort is tolerated, when desire is restrained, when attention remains grounded. Anxiety thrives in confusion. Stoic practice created clarity, and in clarity the mind found room to breathe. In the end, what the Stoics knew about anxiety was neither mysterious nor complicated. It was demanding, honest, and deeply human. They understood that anxiety is not a flaw to be erased, but a condition to be understood. It arises when the mind forgets its proper role, when it tries to command the future, control others, or guarantee outcomes. Anxiety fades not when uncertainty disappears, but when the mind stops fighting what it was never meant to rule. The Stoics did not promise serenity as a constant state. They promised steadiness, a quiet reliability of mind that could face discomfort without collapse. Anxiety loses its power in the presence of this steadiness. Fear may appear, but it no longer dominates. The Stoic does not ask for a life without anxiety. He asks for a life where anxiety no longer decides his actions. They believed that anxiety becomes unbearable only when it is personalized and dramatized. When fear is treated as identity, suffering multiplies. The Stoics gently separated the self from the feeling. Anxiety was an experience, not a definition. It came and went like weather. The sky remained. They also understood that modern minds often seek certainty as comfort. The Stoics offered a different comfort, acceptance. Acceptance not as resignation, but as alignment with reality. To accept uncertainty was not to surrender agency. It was to place agency where it belonged, in judgment, in choice, in character. Anxiety diminishes when energy stops leaking into what cannot be changed. One of their final insights was that anxiety often stems from forgetting mortality, not in a morbid sense, but in a clarifying one. Remembering that life is finite sharpens perspective. Many fears lose importance when measured against limited time. Urgency becomes discernment. Worry gives way to intention. The Stoics did not use mortality to frighten themselves, but to wake themselves. They also believed that community mattered. Anxiety isolates. Stoic wisdom reminded individuals that they were part of something larger, a shared human condition. Others had feared before. Others would fear again. This knowledge softened self-judgment. Anxiety felt less like failure and more like participation in being human. The Stoics did not claim mastery over anxiety. They claimed friendship with reality. They learned to walk alongside uncertainty rather than flee from it. Anxiety weakened because it no longer felt necessary as a warning system. The mind had learned how to listen without panic. What remains powerful about Stoic insight today is its refusal to dramatize inner struggle. Anxiety is not a crisis. It is a message pointing to misaligned judgment, excessive desire, misplaced control. When the message is heard, the noise diminishes. The Stoic path does not offer quick relief. It offers durability, a mind shaped slowly by reason, strengthened by practice, softened by acceptance. Anxiety may still knock, but it no longer storms the house. The door is answered calmly. In this way, Stoicism speaks across centuries. Before psychology named anxiety, the Stoics had already learned how to live with it without being ruled by it. Their wisdom remains relevant not because it removes fear, but because it teaches us how to remain whole in its presence.